The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as James Mitchell adjusted his red uniform for what felt like the 100th time. At 28 years old, he had been serving as a royal guard for 5 years, but the weight of responsibility never seemed to get lighter. His black boots gleamed in the early light, polished to perfection the night before. The tall black hat sat firmly on his head, and his rifle rested at his side in the traditional ceremonial position. James had always dreamed of this job since he was a little boy watching the changing of the guard with his grandmother. She would tell him stories about the brave soldiers who protected the royal family, how they stood perfectly still no matter what happened around them. A true guard, she would say, is like a mountain, strong, steady, and unmovable. Those words had guided him through the rigorous training, the long hours of practice, and the countless days of standing motionless while tourists took pictures and sometimes tried to make him laugh or move. The palace was already bustling with early morning visitors. Tour groups gathered near the gates, cameras ready to capture the famous guards in their iconic uniforms. James took his position at the main entrance, his face set in the neutral expression he had perfected over the years. His training had taught him to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. He noticed the excited children pointing at him, the elderly couples reminiscing about their previous visits, and the occasional person who seemed more interested in testing his resolve than appreciating the tradition. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew larger. James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He had learned to let his mind wander during these long periods of standing. Today, his thoughts drifted to his girlfriend Sarah, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. They had been together for 3 years, and he had been thinking about proposing. The ring was already purchased, hidden in his small apartment, waiting for the right moment. Sarah understood his job, the long hours, the physical demands, and the mental discipline required. She had never complained when he came home exhausted or when his work schedule interrupted their plans. The sound of raised voices pulled James back to the present moment. Near the tour group area, he could see a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair gesticulating wildly at one of the tour guides. She wore expensive-looking clothes and carried a large designer handbag. Her voice carried across the courtyard, though James couldn't make out the specific words from his position. The tour guide, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, was clearly trying to remain professional while dealing with whatever complaint the woman had. James had seen situations like this before. Sometimes visitors became frustrated with wait times, ticket prices, or restrictions about where they could go. The palace had strict security protocols, and not everyone understood or appreciated the reasons behind them. Most complaints were resolved quickly and quietly by the staff, but occasionally things escalated. As a guard, James was trained to observe and report, intervening only if there was a direct threat to security or if specifically requested by palace personnel. The woman's voice grew louder, and James could now make out some of her words. She seemed upset about being told she couldn't enter a certain area with her large bag without going through additional security screening. The tour guide was explaining the policy politely, but the woman was having none of it. She demanded to speak to someone in charge, insisted that she was being discriminated against, and claimed that she had special rights as a taxpayer. Other visitors began to notice the commotion. Some moved away from the area, while others seemed drawn to the drama. Parents pulled their children closer, and elderly visitors looked concerned. James felt a familiar tension building in his shoulders. In his 5 years as a guard, he had witnessed numerous incidents, from minor complaints to serious security threats. His training had prepared him for various scenarios, but each situation was unique and required careful judgment. The tour guide was doing his best to de-escalate the situation, speaking in calm, measured tones while the woman's agitation continued to build. She pointed her finger at him accusingly and took a step closer, invading his personal space in a way that made the young man visibly uncomfortable. James noted the body language, the positioning, and the growing attention from other visitors. The woman's behavior was becoming disruptive to the peaceful atmosphere the palace tried to maintain. Suddenly, the woman turned away from the tour guide and began looking around the courtyard, as if searching for someone else to direct her anger toward. Her eyes scanned the area, passing over the various staff members and security personnel. When her gaze landed on James, standing in his traditional position, something seemed to shift in her expression. Perhaps she saw him as a symbol of the authority she was rebelling against, or maybe she thought a guard would have more power to override the policies she disagreed with. James watched as the woman began walking purposefully in his direction. His training kicked in automatically. He maintained his position and expression while mentally preparing for whatever interaction was about to occur. The woman's stride was aggressive, her jaw set with determination. Other visitors noticed her movement and began to follow at a distance, sensing that something significant was about to happen. As she approached, James could see the anger in her eyes more clearly. Her face was flushed, and her breathing appeared rapid and shallow. She clutched her handbag tightly in one hand while the other was clenched into a fist. Every instinct told James that this encounter would not be pleasant, but his duty was clear: remain professional, maintain protocol, and handle the situation according to his training. The woman stopped directly in front of James, close enough that he could smell her strong perfume. She looked up at him expectantly, waiting for some kind of reaction or acknowledgement. James continued to stare straight ahead, following the protocol that had been drilled into him during countless hours of training. Guards were not supposed to engage in conversation with visitors unless there was a specific security concern or they were asked direct questions by authorized personnel. "Excuse me," the woman said loudly, her voice carrying a tone of barely controlled fury. "I'm talking to you." When James didn't respond, she repeated herself, this time with more volume and aggression. "I said, excuse me. Are you deaf or just rude?" The crowd that had gathered at a respectful distance began to murmur among themselves. Some people had their phones out, recording what they sensed might become a viral moment. James remained motionless. His training had prepared him for this exact scenario. Visitors often tried to get guards to break protocol by speaking to them, touching them, or even insulting them. The guards were expected to maintain their professional demeanor and position regardless of provocation. Only in cases of direct physical threat or when authorized personnel gave specific instructions were they supposed to deviate from their stoic stance. The woman's frustration reached a boiling point. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "I'm a citizen, and you're supposed to serve the public. I have every right to speak to you, and you have an obligation to respond." Her voice echoed off the palace walls, drawing even more attention from visitors and staff members throughout the courtyard. James felt sweat beginning to form under his uniform despite the cool morning air. Maintaining perfect stillness while under intense scrutiny and verbal assault required tremendous mental discipline. He focused on his breathing, keeping it steady and controlled. In his peripheral vision, he could see palace security personnel beginning to take notice of the situation. He trusted that they would intervene if necessary, but, for now, he had to endure whatever this woman threw at him. The woman moved even closer, now standing just inches from James. Her anger seemed to be feeding on his lack of response, growing stronger with each passing moment of silence. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" she hissed. "Standing there in your fancy uniform, looking down on regular people. Well, let me tell you something, mister. You work for us. We pay your salary through our taxes, and that means you answer to us." The crowd had grown significantly larger now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. James could hear cameras clicking and the soft sounds of video recording. He knew that whatever happened next would likely be shared on social media within minutes. The thought of his grandmother seeing him on the news, of Sarah worrying about him, flashed through his mind. But his duty remained clear: maintain dignity, follow protocol, and trust in his training. The woman raised her voice even higher, apparently frustrated by James's continued silence. "This is what's wrong with this country," she declared to the crowd as much as to James. "Public servants who think they're too good to interact with the public. Well, I've had enough of this attitude." Her words were met with murmurs from the crowd, some supportive, others clearly uncomfortable with her behavior. James noticed that palace security was slowly moving closer, but they seemed to be waiting to see if the situation would resolve itself. The standard protocol was to allow guards to handle verbal confrontations on their own unless physical intervention became necessary. James appreciated their restraint, as unnecessary interference could make him appear unable to handle his duties independently.
The woman seemed to interpret the growing crowd as validation of her position.
She turned partially toward the onlookers, gesturing at James as if he were evidence in a trial.
"Look at this," she announced.
"This is what we're paying for with our tax money." Arrogant guards who won't even acknowledge when a citizen speaks to them. This is supposed to be a public building, serving the public, but, apparently, some people think they're above basic courtesy. James remained focused on maintaining his composure. His training had included psychological preparation for exactly this type of harassment. Instructors had warned him that some visitors would try to provoke reactions through verbal abuse, personal attacks, or even false accusations. The key was to remember that such behavior usually stemmed from the individual's own frustrations and insecurities rather than any legitimate grievance against the guards or the institution they protected. The confrontation had been going on for several minutes now, but, to James, it felt like hours. His muscles ached from maintaining perfect posture while under stress, and his mind raced with potential scenarios for how this might end.
Would security eventually intervene? Would the woman eventually give up and walk away? Would she escalate to physical contact, forcing him to respond according to his training for such situations? As if reading his thoughts, the woman's behavior took a darker turn.
She moved even closer to James, now practically touching him with her presence. Her voice dropped to a menacing whisper that only he could hear clearly.
"I know exactly what you're thinking right now," she said. "You're thinking you're so tough, so disciplined.
But, I bet you're really just a scared little boy playing dress-up. I bet if I pushed the right buttons, you'd crumble like everyone else." The psychological pressure was intense, but James drew strength from his memories of training and from the pride he felt in his role. He thought about the centuries of tradition he was part of, the countless guards who had stood in similar positions before him, facing their own challenges and proving their worth through dedication and professionalism.
He would not be the one to break the chain of honor.
The woman seemed to sense that her verbal assault wasn't having the desired effect. Her frustration reached new heights, and James could see in her body language that she was considering more drastic measures. The moment felt balanced on a knife's edge, with the potential for escalation hanging heavy in the air. The crowd had grown silent, sensing the tension and waiting to see what would happen next. James prepared himself mentally for whatever might come, drawing on every ounce of training and personal strength he possessed. In that moment, standing perfectly still while under assault from an angry stranger, he understood more clearly than ever what his grandmother had meant about being like a mountain. The storm would rage around him, but he would endure, unmoved and unbroken, protecting the dignity of his position and the trust placed in him by his service and his country. The tension in the courtyard reached a breaking point as the woman's anger transformed into something more dangerous. James could feel the shift in the air around him, the way the crowd had grown completely silent, holding their collective breath as they sensed what was coming. The woman's face had turned a deep shade of red, and her hands trembled with barely contained rage.
"You know what?" she said, her voice rising to a near shriek. "I've had enough of this disrespectful treatment. If you won't acknowledge me with words, maybe you'll respond to this." Without warning, she raised her hand and struck James hard across the face with her open palm. The sound of the slap echoed off the palace walls like a gunshot, sharp and shocking in the morning air. The crowd gasped collectively, and several people stepped backward instinctively. James's cheek burned from the impact, and he felt his head jerk slightly to the side from the force of the blow. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Every muscle in his body tensed, and his training warred with his natural human instinct to defend himself. The sting of the slap was nothing compared to the shock of realizing that this situation had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But James held his position. Despite the burning sensation on his face, despite the humiliation of being struck in front of hundreds of people, despite every fiber of his being screaming at him to react, he remained perfectly still. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind, "A true guard is like a mountain. Mountains don't strike back when lightning hits them, they endure and continue standing long after the storm has passed." The woman seemed shocked by her own actions for a brief moment, her hand still raised in the air where she had left it after the slap. But, instead of showing remorse, her expression hardened even further. "There," she said, lowering her hand slowly. "Now maybe you'll listen to me.
maybe now you'll show some respect to the people who pay your salary. James could feel the warmth spreading across his cheek where her hand had made contact. His jaw ached, and he could taste a slight metallic flavor in his mouth where he had accidentally bitten his tongue from the impact. But his training held firm. He had been taught that physical assault on a guard was a serious crime, but that his first responsibility was to maintain order and dignity. Retaliation would only escalate the situation and potentially put innocent bystanders at risk. The palace security team was already in motion. James could see them approaching from multiple directions, their movements quick but controlled. They had been trained to handle situations exactly like this one, where visitors crossed the line from verbal harassment to physical assault. The woman seemed oblivious to their approach, still focused entirely on James and apparently convinced that she had finally gotten through to him. "That's right," she continued, interpreting his continued silence as some kind of victory. "Now you know I'm serious. Now you understand that you can't just ignore people and think there won't be consequences." She turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. "You all saw that, right? You saw how he treated me with complete disrespect, and how I had to defend myself." Several people in the crowd were shaking their heads, clearly disagreeing with her version of events. Others had their phones out, recording everything that was happening. James knew that within minutes, footage of him being slapped would be circulating on social media, probably with various interpretations and commentary attached. The thought of his family and friends seeing him being humiliated in such a public way was almost more painful than the physical blow itself. The lead security officer, a man James knew as Sergeant Collins, reached the scene first. He was a veteran of the Palace Guard himself, having served for over 15 years before moving into security leadership. His presence was commanding but calm, the result of decades of experience dealing with difficult situations. "Ma'am," Sergeant Collins said, his voice firm but professional, "I need you to step away from the guard immediately. Assaulting palace personnel is a serious offense, and you're being detained pending further investigation." The woman whirled around to face him, her anger now redirected toward this new authority figure. "Detained? Are you kidding me? I'm the victim here. This guard was being completely disrespectful to me, ignoring me when I was trying to ask a simple question. I was defending myself against his rudeness." "Ma'am, I observed the entire incident," Sergeant Collins replied calmly. "The guard was performing his duties according to protocol. You initiated physical contact by striking him without provocation. That constitutes assault under the law, regardless of your perception of the circumstances." James remained in position, but he felt a wave of relief knowing that his supervisor had witnessed everything and understood exactly what had happened. The burning sensation in his cheek was beginning to subside, but he could feel that the area was swelling slightly. The woman's rings had left small scratches where they had scraped across his skin. Other security officers had now formed a loose perimeter around the area, gently but firmly moving the crowd back to give everyone more space. The woman seemed to realize for the first time that she was surrounded by law enforcement and that the situation was no longer under her control. "This is ridiculous," she protested, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I want to speak to your supervisor. I want to file a complaint about that guard's behavior. He was being deliberately provocative and disrespectful." "You'll have the opportunity to explain your version of events," Sergeant Collins assured her, "but right now, I need you to cooperate with our procedures. Please place your hands behind your back." The woman's eyes widened as she realized that she was actually being arrested. "Wait, you can't be serious. I didn't do anything wrong." He was asking for it with his attitude. "Anyone would have reacted the same way I did." James watched as the situation unfolded, maintaining his position even as the drama continued around him. He felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that justice was being served, embarrassment at having been struck in such a public setting, and a strange sense of pride that he had maintained his composure throughout the entire ordeal. The woman continued to protest as she was handcuffed, her voice growing more shrill with each passing moment. "This is discrimination," she shouted. "This is police brutality. I'm going to sue all of you. I'm going to contact the media and tell them how I was treated here today." Several members of the crowd called out in response, telling her that she was wrong, that the guard had done nothing to provoke her attack. Some people shouted their support for James, praising his professionalism under difficult circumstances. Others simply shook their heads in disgust at her behavior. As the security team prepared to escort the woman away, she made one final attempt to justify her actions. She turned back toward James, straining against the handcuffs. "You think you've won something here," she said, her voice filled with venom. "But everyone saw what happened. Everyone knows the truth about how arrogant and disrespectful you people really are." James continued to stare straight ahead, giving no indication that he had heard her words. Inside, however, he felt a deep sadness for this woman who seemed so consumed by anger and entitlement that she couldn't recognize her own responsibility for what had happened. He wondered what had brought her to this point, what experiences or frustrations had made her think that striking another human being was an appropriate response to not getting her way. Sergeant Collins approached James after the woman had been led away. "Guard Mitchell," he said quietly, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No, sir," James replied, speaking for the first time since the incident began. "I'm fit for duty." "Good man," the sergeant said, examining James's face more closely. "You've got some swelling and a few scratches, but nothing that looks serious. Still, I want you to be checked by medical personnel after your shift. We need documentation of your injuries for the incident report." James nodded his understanding. The reality of what had happened was beginning to sink in fully. He had been assaulted while performing his duties, but he had maintained his professionalism and followed his training perfectly. The incident would be investigated, charges would likely be filed against his attacker, and the whole thing would become part of his permanent service record. "The crowd is dispersing now," Sergeant Collins continued, "but there will probably be media attention once word gets out. Are you prepared to continue your duties, or would you prefer to be relieved for the remainder of your shift?" James considered the question carefully. Every part of him wanted to say yes, he was ready to continue, that one angry tourist wasn't going to drive him from his post. But he also recognized that his concentration might be compromised, and that his swollen face might be a distraction for other visitors. "I'd like to continue if possible, sir," he said finally. "But I understand if you think it's better for me to stand down." Sergeant Collins studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "I think you've demonstrated remarkable professionalism today, Guard Mitchell. If you feel ready to continue, I'll respect that decision. However, I want you to know that there's no shame in taking time to process what happened. Being assaulted is a traumatic experience, even for someone with your training." The courtyard was beginning to return to normal as the crowd dispersed and new visitors arrived who were unaware of what had transpired. James resumed his ceremonial position, though he could feel the occasional stare from people who had witnessed the incident or heard about it from others. As the morning progressed toward afternoon, James found his mind wandering more than usual. He thought about the woman who had attacked him, wondering where she was now, whether she was sitting in a jail cell or had been released on bail. He thought about how the incident might affect his career, whether it would be seen as a mark against him or as evidence of his dedication to duty. Most of all, he thought about Sarah. She would be finishing her shift at the hospital soon, probably looking forward to spending a quiet evening together. How would he tell her what had happened? Would she worry about his safety in ways she hadn't before? Would this incident change how she felt about his career choice? The irony wasn't lost on him that while he stood protecting the palace and its traditions, he couldn't protect himself from the unpredictable actions of an angry visitor. But that was part of the job, part of the sacrifice that came with serving in this role. Not all threats came from organized enemies or security breaches. Sometimes they came from ordinary people having their worst moments in public spaces. As his shift continued, James noticed that several of his fellow guards made subtle gestures of support when they passed during their rotations. A slight nod here, a brief moment of eye contact there, small signs that they had heard about what happened and respected how he had handled it. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast different shadows across the courtyard when James realized that something fundamental had changed within him. The incident with the angry woman had tested him in a way that his training exercises never could. Real-world situations carried emotional weight and unpredictable variables that no simulation could fully replicate. He had passed the test. When faced with an actual assault, he had maintained his position, followed his training, and upheld the dignity of his role. The knowledge gave him a new confidence, a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be a royal guard. He was no longer just someone playing the part, he had proven himself under fire. The rest of James's shift passed without incident, but the news of what had happened spread quickly through the palace grounds and beyond. By the time he was relieved at 4 o'clock, there were already news vans gathering outside the main gates. Social media had exploded with videos of the incident, taken from multiple angles by tourists who had witnessed the confrontation and assault. As James walked toward the guard quarters to change out of his uniform, he was intercepted by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the Royal Guard unit. Harrison was a distinguished man in his early 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had dedicated his entire adult life to military service. "Guard Mitchell," the lieutenant colonel said, his voice carrying both authority and concern. "I've been briefed on today's incident. First, let me say that I'm proud of how you conducted yourself under extremely difficult circumstances. Your professionalism reflects well on the entire unit." James stood at attention, feeling both relieved and apprehensive about this conversation. "Thank you, sir. I tried to follow my training as closely as possible." "You did more than that," Harrison replied. "You demonstrated the kind of character and discipline that defines what it means to be a royal guard. However, I need you to understand that this incident is likely to receive significant media attention. We've already had calls from news organizations, and the video footage is being shared widely online." The weight of those words settled on James's shoulders. He had known that the incident would have consequences beyond the immediate moment, but hearing it confirmed by his commanding officer made it feel more real and more serious. "Sir, what does that mean for me?" "For my position?" James asked. "It means that for the next few days, possibly weeks, you're going to be in the spotlight whether you want to be or not," Harrison explained. "The media will try to contact you, strangers will recognize you on the street, and every aspect of how you handled today's situation will be analyzed and debated by people who have never worn the uniform." James nodded, trying to process the implications. He had signed up to be a guard, not a public figure. The idea of being recognized everywhere he went, of having his every action scrutinized by the media and the public, was intimidating. "The good news," Harrison continued, "is that the initial response has been overwhelmingly supportive. The public seems to understand that you were the victim of an unprovoked assault and that you handled it with remarkable professionalism. The woman who attacked you has been charged with assault and disorderly conduct, and she's likely to face additional charges as the investigation continues." The information provided some comfort, but James still felt anxious about what lay ahead. "What should I do if reporters try to contact me, sir?" "All media inquiries are to be directed to the palace press office," Harrison said firmly. "Under no circumstances should you speak to reporters without authorization. Any statements about the incident will come through official channels. Your job is to continue performing your duties to the best of your ability and let the system handle the rest." As James changed out of his ceremonial uniform, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The left side of his face was noticeably swollen, and the scratches from the woman's rings had formed small scabs. The physical evidence of the assault would fade in time, but he wondered how long the emotional and psychological effects might linger. The walk home from the palace took longer than usual, as James found himself taking side streets to avoid the news crews that had gathered near the main entrance. His small apartment was in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away, and he had never been more grateful for its anonymity than he was today. Sarah was already there when he arrived, having finished her hospital shift early. She was sitting on the couch with her laptop open, and, from the expression on her face, James could tell she had already seen the news coverage. "James," she said, standing up immediately when she saw him. Her eyes widened as she took in his swollen face and the visible scratches. "Oh my God, are you okay? I saw the videos online, but seeing you in person." Her voice trailed off as emotion overwhelmed her. James moved toward her, and she embraced him gently, careful not to touch the injured side of his face. The warmth of her arms around him and the familiar scent of her perfume provided the first real comfort he had felt since the morning's incident. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice carried the exhaustion of the day's events.
"Physically, anyway. It's just some swelling and scratches. Nothing serious."
Sarah pulled back to look at him more closely, her nurse's training evident as she examined his injuries.
"Have you had these looked at properly?"
"They need to be cleaned and treated to prevent infection. I have a medical appointment tomorrow morning as part of the incident documentation," James explained.
"But, you're right, they should be cleaned now."
As Sarah gently cleaned his wounds with supplies from her medical kit, they talked about what had happened. James recounted the entire incident, from the moment he first noticed the woman arguing with the tour guide to the point where she was led away in handcuffs. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally wincing when he described particularly difficult moments.
"I can't believe someone would do that to you," she said when he finished his account. "You were just doing your job, standing there like you do every day. What kind of person thinks it's okay to hit someone for that?" James had been wondering the same thing.
In his years as a guard, he had encountered difficult visitors before, but nothing approaching the level of aggression and entitlement displayed by his attacker. He had always assumed that most people, even when frustrated or angry, understood basic boundaries about physical contact.
"I keep thinking about what might have been going through her mind," he said.
"She seemed so convinced that she was in the right, that I somehow deserved what she did to me. I wonder if she's sitting somewhere right now still believing that she was the victim in all this." Sarah finished treating his injuries and sat back down beside him. "From what I saw in the videos, she seemed completely out of touch with reality.
The way she tried to turn the crowd against you, the way she justified hitting you, that's not normal behavior. That's someone who has serious problems with anger and entitlement."
They spent the evening watching news coverage of the incident together. The story had been picked up by national news outlets, and the videos were being shared widely on social media. The response was overwhelmingly supportive of James, with thousands of comments praising his professionalism and condemning his attacker's behavior.
But not all the attention was positive.
Some commenters questioned whether James should have responded differently, whether his silence had somehow provoked the woman's escalation. Others used the incident as an opportunity to express broader complaints about government spending or the relevance of traditional ceremonies in modern times.
"Don't read the negative comments," Sarah advised, noticing James's expression as he scrolled through his phone.
"There will always be people who find fault with everything. Focus on the fact that the vast majority of people understand what really happened and support you."
The next morning brought new challenges.
James woke to find news vans parked on his street and reporters waiting outside his building. His phone had dozens of missed calls from unknown numbers, and his social media accounts had been flooded with friend requests and messages from strangers. The medical examination confirmed that his injuries were superficial and would heal completely within a week or two. The doctor who examined him was thorough in documenting everything for the official incident report, taking photographs and making detailed notes about the extent and location of each injury. When James returned to work the following day, he found that the palace had implemented additional security measures in response to the incident. There were more security personnel visible in public areas, and new protocols had been established for dealing with aggressive or confrontational visitors. His fellow guards welcomed him back with a mixture of sympathy and admiration. Many of them shared stories of their own encounters with difficult visitors, though none had experienced anything quite as extreme as what James had endured. The incident had become a teaching moment for the entire unit, a real-world example of the importance of maintaining composure under pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called James into his office that afternoon to discuss the ongoing investigation and the media response. The woman who had attacked him, whose name was revealed as Margaret Thornton, had been released on bail but was facing multiple charges. Her lawyer had made statements to the press claiming that she had been provoked and that the incident was being blown out of proportion. Her legal team is trying to control the narrative, Harrison explained, but the evidence is overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, clear video footage, and your exemplary conduct throughout the entire encounter.
I don't expect her defense strategy to be successful.
The meeting also covered the long-term implications for James's career. The incident had brought him a level of public recognition that was unusual for palace guards, most of whom served their entire careers in relative anonymity. Harrison wanted to ensure that James was prepared for the ongoing attention and that he understood how it might affect his future opportunities within the service.
"There's been discussion at the highest levels about your conduct during this incident," Harrison said.
"Your professionalism under extreme circumstances has been noted by people well above my pay grade. This could open doors for advancement opportunities that might not otherwise have been available to you." James felt a complex mix of emotions about that possibility. He had never sought fame or recognition, he had simply tried to do his job to the best of his ability. The idea that his worst day might lead to career advancement felt strange and somewhat uncomfortable. Over the following weeks, the intensity of media attention gradually decreased, but James's life remained changed in fundamental ways. He was occasionally recognized in public, sometimes by people who wanted to thank him for his service or express support for how he had handled the incident. Other times, he encountered people who had opinions about his actions or wanted to debate the broader implications of the encounter. The woman who had attacked him, Margaret Thornton, eventually pleaded guilty to assault charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was required to pay a fine, perform community service, and attend anger management counseling. Her lawyer read a brief statement expressing regret for the incident, but Thornton herself never personally apologized to James. The lack of a personal apology bothered James more than he expected it would. He didn't need her to grovel or beg for forgiveness, but some acknowledgement that she understood the impact of her actions would have provided a sense of closure that he found himself craving.
Sarah helped him process these feelings during their long conversations about the incident and its aftermath.
She pointed out that some people are simply unable or unwilling to take responsibility for their actions, and that James couldn't control her response any more than he had been able to control her initial attack. "The important thing," she reminded him, "is how you responded. You maintained your dignity and professionalism when someone tried to strip both away from you. You represented your values and your profession perfectly, regardless of how she chooses to view what happened." Those words resonated with James as he continued his duties in the following months. The incident had tested him in ways he never could have imagined, but it had also confirmed his belief in the importance of his role and his ability to fulfill it with honor.